thank you so much for coming out. I think it's great to see you all here. It's a fantastic book. It's a beautiful book. It's not just a timely book, and I think that since I read it a couple months ago, it's something that I've continued to think about, both as the political scene has unfolded, but also in more general ways. And very glad to be sharing the stage with Elliot again. And I thought maybe the best way to start would be if you could give us just a short reading from the book.
Yeah, sure. So I always think in these matters it's best to just like start at the beginning. So this is the opening of the book. The morning he went off to his second war, Harris Abadi spent 20 minutes in the sauna of the Tujan Hotel. Clean by his sweat, he swaddled himself in a complimentary bathrobe, went up to his room, and took a long shower. Then he went back to sleep, waking naked on his bed an hour later. Downstairs for a late breakfast, he ate 3 butter croissants with jam. The concierge found Harris in the large, empty dining room, its circular table set with fine crystal, as if waiting for a party that would never come. Leaning over Harris, the concierge grasped the lapels of his suit jacket, where he wore a pinned insignia of crossed gold keys. He asked Harris something in Turkish. Harris didn't speak Turkish and shrugged back, his mouth still full of flaky croissant. The concierge tried Arabic. "How was your stay then?" "Good, thank you," said Harris. "Business or pleasure?" "Business," answered Harris. There was no other reason to come to Antep, an industrial backwater along Turkey's southern border with Syria. The concierge looked at the stuffed hiking pack propped against the leg of Harris's chair. "Checking out then?" Harris reached deep into an internal pocket on the pack, fishing around for his cash. He pulled out a mixed roll of Turkish lira, American dollars, and Syrian pounds. He held the wad beneath the table, counting it bill by bill. The concierge hovered above him. 200 a night, yes?" asked Harris, peeling 600 lira off his roll. The concierge nodded, eyeing Harris's dollars. "You're American?" he asked. Harris handed over the money for 3 nights. "Here, 600. He felt the concierge taking a closer look at him, his pack, his Desert Suede combat boots. "I'd prefer you pay in dollars," said the concierge. As hard as he'd worked to become an American, Harris hated the way his new clothes and strong currency betrayed him abroad. He paid in dollars, and the concierge tucked the tight fold of 20s into his vest's front pocket. "Allow me to find you a cab." Harris nodded, then got up and went to the bathroom, leaving his heavy pack unattended in the opulent dining room. He didn't seem to care if everything was taken from him.
So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about some of the experiences that came into the formation of this novel. I know once you said to me that, when you start writing fiction, usually you feel like you're sort of standing in the field, knocking 2 things against each other, trying to make a spark, and that those 2 things usually tend to be things that happen to you, that you personally experienced. And I know you've been living in Istanbul for some time and spending a lot of time on the Syrian border, so I wondered if you could talk about that.
Sure. So the thing I was saying to Phil once was that when I write fiction, I often feel like my job is I'm like standing in a field of like high, dry grass. And my job is to try to light the entire field on fire. So like setting things on fire. And I've got 2 things in my hand, like flints, basically. And I'm like striking them together as hard as I can to make sparks. And oftentimes, whatever those sparks are, those flints are they're real experiences. They are things that happen to me. Like I've been to the Tujan Hotel. I spent a lot of time in the Tujan Hotel. I've been to the sauna in the Tujan Hotel. But then, when those sparks go and they hit the dry grass, and when my writing's going well, that fire is spreading. That's imagination. So specific to this novel, at the time I had recently sold my first book. I had a friend of mine who'd spent a long time working at the American University in Afghanistan, and we met in Washington, D.C. one night, and he was frankly just looking for some career advice. He said, "Well, I've been working at the American University in Afghanistan for 6 years. As a single American there, I get paid lots of money. I live in Kabul, so I've got this big bank account. I'm thinking about maybe going to work for the State Department. I said, no, don't do that, it'll be boring. Maybe going to grad school. I said, no, don't do that, it'll be a waste of time. He said, well, because I have this money, I was thinking maybe about starting like a company that will bid on research grants from the US government and other governments to focus on Syria. And I'll go to the Syrian border and I'll do this. I'm going to set up this company. I have a friend of mine who has similar experiences to me, and I was like, that sounds like a great idea. Like, if you, not only is that a great idea, if you do that, like, let me know, because I'm coming. So he wound up setting up his company 6 months later, and I wound up, not working for them, but basically showing up. They gave me entree to be down there. And I went because I thought that it would be worth going, that that's where things were happening. And this was sort of in summer and fall of 2013. And, and a lot of what I started seeing down there, there were things that I wanted to write about, but the one kind of nagging question that I got was from a number of my Syrian friends. And it was sort of this conflict you could see within many of them. And these are people who've been very active in the revolution. So on any given night, I could go out with a number of different Syrians who were kind of living in this liminal state as refugees on the border. They hadn't gone to Europe yet and kind of given up on Syria, but they knew they couldn't go back for a variety of reasons. It was too dangerous for them. So we could be sitting out at dinner on any given night, and as we are looking at the menu, ordering, getting drinks, we would start talking politics. Often I would be the only American there, and they would be, thumping the table saying, Elliot, you don't understand. The revolution can still succeed. The U.S. and the West needs to support the Free Syrian Army. Bashar al-Assad's regime doesn't actually hold that much land. The Islamic State isn't really viable. This can still happen. And then we would talk about that, and often I would, frankly, just listen. And then oftentimes, we would have our entree, and by the time we were sitting down, and the dessert had come up or we're having tea, they would be staring into the tea saying, you know what? I have to tell you, I regret the whole thing. Like, I wish we'd never gone out in the streets. I wish we never protested. Like, I've destroyed my home, and I can't go back. And so seeing that really deep schism, with many of these people continually expressed, it was, I don't know if surprising is the right word, but it was very poignant to see that. But what was surprising for me was when I looked at my own experience, again, like those flints of mine that are like my true life, I was like, well, in some ways, like, I could recognize that emotional journey that they were taking, because, when I was in my early 20s, I fought in Iraq in 2004, and it sounds horribly naive to say this now, but I can remember what people were talking about in 2001, 2002, 2003. What are we doing over there? Why are we going? And amongst the many reasons, one of them was, this is a part of the world where people have lived under authoritarianism for years and years and years, and we are going to liberate them and offer them up a more democratic society. And so, like, that was the ideology that we went to war with. I then went and fought in Iraq, saw how that war played out, fought in Afghanistan, saw how that war played out. Those wars are still going on. I would say that I was sort of ideologically dispossessed. And I could look at my Syrian friend and say, I think, you're also ideologically dispossessed and questioning, this experience that you're very proud of, but at the same time, feel real conflict about your participation in this. And then when I look at it, well, what is it that dispossessed us? Like, what are those forces? And I was like, well, it's authoritarianism and radical Islam in both of our cases. And so then strangely, you kind of make this connection, like, isn't it crazy? Like, in this weird way, like, we're sort of veterans of the same war. And that surprised me.
Mm-hmm.
Like on a sort of almost subconscious level, I started writing about it.
Yeah. There's a passage in the book that actually speaks to that on 137, where one of the characters, Amir, talks about his feelings having been a part of the early stages of the revolution. I was wondering if you could just read that paragraph.
Sure. Okay. So this is, when the book opened, you met this fellow named Abadi, and he is an Iraqi American, so a naturalized American citizen, and he wants to go fight in Syria for reasons that you learn. He then is mugged on the border and is taken in by a Syrian refugee who'd been active in the revolution, who is Amir. And this is Amir speaking now about the revolution. So, I suppose it began with the revolution. Back then we named all the protests. The Friday of Martyrs, the Friday of Rage, the Friday of Steadfastness. Many times since, I've wished I could grab my old self by the shirt collar and shout in my own face, "Idiot, do you know what it means to be a martyr? You march for the honor of having your life destroyed." Even if I told myself, it wouldn't have mattered. When you start marching, you stop listening. I never listened when Daphne came to me with her fears. I answered her with slogans such as, "History will remember those who chose change in the moment of change." I asked her how I could call myself a man if I abandoned my country's cause. At night, in the darkness of our bedroom, we argued. I told her she could leave and I'd stay. I never once thought of her decision. How could she call herself a wife if she abandoned her husband? And of course there was Kifa. And Kifa is their daughter.
And one of the things that's really interesting about the book is you pair Haris, who's going back to war, with this couple, and there's the husband's sort of failed revolutionary dreams, the sort of withered kind of revolutionary dreams that still kind of hold an aura for him, and then his wife, and you pair that sentiment with a kind of marriage that is falling apart. And how did you, what led you to that, that pairing?
Well, I think like something I'm often, I'm interested in writing books that are sort of, engaged in that, and I think when you look at the world and everything that's happening, specifically when you look at, Turkey, Syria, Iraq, like the complexities of these conflicts make them completely like impenetrable, even for people who are following them closely. And so, how do you tell a story or write a book that can make someone half a world away like feel a little bit of what it's like to sit across from someone who says like, I regret my revolution? Because I think it's important that we understand some of the emotional complexities that are going on in these conflicts. That's what I'm interested in writing about. So what I'm often searching for is sort of like, is an emotional equivalency. And so I had a number of people speaking to me, and I could intuitively sense as well, like, they really said, I fell in love with the revolution. I was completely in love with this idea. Do you know what it feels like when you've never been able to speak freely in your whole life, to go out into the streets and like scream in a police officer's face and tell him what you think? He's like, it was euphoria. But then seeing the sort of the heartbreak that existed on the backside when it didn't work out. And so as much as someone had fallen in love with the revolution, what you could see is, in some respects, a marriage is sort of a revolution in its way. It's two people abandoning what their world had once been as an individual to merge with another, create a new world out of it, and then believe completely in that world for whatever their life is. But when that doesn't work out, or a revolution doesn't work out, there's this splitting, and there's broken glass, and there's people trying to make sense of the wreckage and build something out of it. So when you meet Amir and his wife Daphne, who are these two characters that our protagonist Harris kind of winds up staying with, what you learn about them is that they're from Aleppo. Amir left the house one day to run an errand. There was an explosion in the house. The home collapsed, and he manages to get his wife out of the rubble, and he takes her about an hour's drive across the border to get medical attention. From what he sees, he's convinced that their daughter is dead. The wife comes to and cannot accept this loss in their life. And so when Harris meets them, the wife is sort of angling and dealing with her grief and considering going back across the border and try to just search for whatever the daughter, which she kind of thinks might be alive. And the husband's like, you don't understand, like this girl is dead and we need to get on with our lives. And that kind of comes to this idea of the daughter is this larger question that you would see amongst so many specifically people who've been engaged with the revolution were wrestling with, who are sitting in Gaziantep, which is like not the place you want to necessarily restart your life. Which this idea is it better to cling to a lost cause that is a righteous cause, no matter how delusional it seems that belief is, to hold on to the cause, or is it better to cut your losses and just start anew? And that's sort of the tension between this couple.
Now, and in addition to that, the sort of the marriage, the idealism, you've also got this sort of pull of war and violence, right? And you actually spent time not just talking with people who'd been in the revolution, but you met up with, for example, a guy who'd fought on the other side in Iraq, right? Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, he loved baklava from this one place, and I'd always get him his favorite baklava, and we would hang out. Well, one thing that really, in the book that sort of interests me, and I think is just a theme I'm interested in, I think you're interested in is too, is like, what is war? In so much as like war can be it can be something that, it can be like a redemptive act. Like people can go to war to prove themselves or to sort of purge themselves of some type of sin. Or it can be like a very self-destructive act. Like people can go to war to basically kill themselves. So in writing this book, there's sort of like another literary moment that I remember reading it really, really struck me and kind of kept just sort of lingering around in my subconscious and still does, was if you've read Anna Karenina, by the way, big spoiler alert here, at the end of the book, after Anna throws herself in front of the train, committing suicide, her lover, sort of the dashing one-time military officer, Count Vronsky, so who has given up his military career to be with Anna, she kills herself, and now he's sort of figuring out what his life is going to be. And so the last you hear of Vronsky, in this tome of a book, is he's reported to having been seen on a train, kind of standing outside of the train, heading to the Caucasus to rejoin his regiment to go fight. And so, first of all, I remember the first time reading that, and maybe it's like a former, military officer myself. I found it incredibly sad, this image of this guy alone on the train heading to the Caucasus. But there's this question, why is Vronsky doing this? Is Vronsky doing this to kill himself, or is he doing it to redeem himself for his affair with Anna? And you never really know in the book. And so, in some ways, at least on an emotional level, I feel like this book kind of ends where that one. This book begins where that one ends. You sort of basically meet this Harris Abadi character, kind of as he's the Vronsky heading out on his train. But specific to that, there are a number of people I met, to your question, who had been fighters. My friend who likes the baklava, his name is Abu Hassar, and we had a number of meetings where we would sit around and we would talk about the wars from different perspectives. But what was undeniable between us was, that was. In our relatively young lives, that was the defining event of it. Mm-hmm. And so, we were bound to one another by that event. And at one point, a Syrian friend of mine who had been translating for us, I remember, we sat down the first time we met, and we ended up having this, we were going to have lunch, and we sat there for 5 or 6 hours talking and, drinking lots of tea, and we drew a map, and we were sort of, saying where looking at the battlefield and all of that. And my friend who had been translating for us at hour 4 is I'm sorry, I have to go to the bathroom. And so we'd had this great rapport, but he goes up and he goes to the bathroom. And now we're sitting there across from one another, and we can't talk. And it was incredibly awkward. It was we were two, 7th graders on their first dates. What do we do now? And then what he started doing was, because we'd sort of built this map, he started writing dates. He wrote a date. Because we can all kind of, I can recognize Arabic numbers. And so he wrote a date down. Then I wrote a date next to it. And we started writing dates on all the places to see if we'd fought in the same place at the same date. But just, that was a very, very common language. And you can't deny it. I feel, I would say, I feel closer to him and feel like I have more in common than him with someone who's maybe of my own generation who had a very, very different experience in their 20s.
There's the really interesting moment in the book where, so there's this backstory to Harris where he'd spent time with special forces guys and has a really complicated relationship with one of them. And I wondered if you could just read this section where they talk about Colombia on page 78.
Sure. Colombia in the 90s, said Jim. That was a great war. Not too violent, but interesting enough. Weeks spent in the jungle, weekends spent in Bogota, lots of girls, lots of booze, and I was young. And the tattoo? Asked Harris. Jim nodded. The early Christians believed that your soul existed in your stomach. That's where you felt right and wrong, in your guts. The Incans believed the sun was eternal. Eternal sun on my eternal soul. You found your soul down there, said Harris, as he drank from the bottle of Colombian rum, taking communion with Jim. I guess you could say that. Do you think you'll go back? To Colombia? No. I mean, only if my wife makes me. The war's pretty much over there. There'd be no point. Harris turned up his eyes, drawing a blank. Jim canted his head, shaking it sympathetically. It's not what I found in Colombia, bud. It's what I found in the war. This is where I belong. What about home? This is home, answered Jim. He took the bottle from Harris and drank. They had emptied nearly a quarter of it.
There are these characters for whom, they're these sort of ideological structures that we use to kind of talk about war and understand, why are people doing things. And then there's this sort of just kind of appeal that it has even outside of any kind of ideology to justify it, right? And I wondered if, you spoke of Harris, is he going to commit suicide? Is he going to redeem himself? Or is he going because there's a part of him that likes it? And one of the things that I thought was so interesting about the book is, I think particularly in literary fiction, we're very accustomed to the notion that war is hell. Mm-hmm. And in this book, you also get at, why would somebody want to go to war? Why would somebody want to go back? And why might somebody want to join even the Daesh?
Right, and I think it goes to, like when you meet Harris, he's a guy who's searching for a purpose. And initially he thinks that's to go fight with the Free Syrian Army. He says, he basically wants to fight for a war that he thinks is a good war because he believes he'd fought in a bad one. But that very quickly unravels, I think by page 28. And then he's sort of trying to figure out what the causes that he's looking for. But I think it's sort of an interesting question right now, is so much is made about why would anyone conceivably go fight with the Islamic State? How can we understand this pure evil, which is the Islamic State? And I'll say, looking at a group like the Islamic State from here, it looks very different than from in the region. I mean, in the region, I was in Iraq in October. It actually looks much more what you think of as a conventional war. I mean, the Islamic State there, when you talk to people, as much is the Sunni political group. Is this is the Islamic State. They're fighting for the Sunni people, and it's not sort of the horrific images we see here. But for instance, there was a I know I told you this, or we talked about this. There was a Pentagon task force that was convened. It was probably a little over a year ago. And it was sort of the brass of the Pentagon got together and said, listen, we are so baffled by why anyone would possibly go and fight alongside the Islamic State and how they're recruiting people out of Western Europe and even the US. We are assembling a task force of our best minds to try to figure out what is going on here. I remember reading that, I think maybe laughing with you about it, and other people what do you mean you need to assemble a task force? So you're telling me you need to assemble a task force to figure out why on earth a bunch of 19, 20, 21-year-olds, when shown glossy promotional videos and given sort of an interesting ideology and narrative, would go across the world to fight when they have a very comfortable home. You guys are the best at this. You've been doing this for 225 years. The Few, the Proud, J. Walter Thompson, the ad campaigns, the Islamic State does it. They just, they message a little bit differently. It's, come ride with us, liberate your homeland, be like the Prophet's companions in 600 AD. So the fact that we can't get that, I find very disconcerting. So I'll say, I get it. I don't agree with it, but I get why a 20-year-old kid, living in Norway, not feeling that is their home necessarily, might be lured to, go to Raqqa and fight against Iranian militias. I get it.
The other thing that, the character of Daphne, it's funny, there were these scenes that I wanted to have you read, and then I was looking at them and I was like, no, I don't want to ruin it for the audience has got to get it to it in the book because that scene's so good when it hits. I don't want to cut it out of the book. And alongside that, you've got these kind of basic units of social organization. Ideology is one way that people kind of band together, but then there's just families and even Harris's relationship with his sister, who's also in the United States, which is kind of really beautifully articulated in the relationship that they have and why he chooses to leave her and how he sort of gives himself permission to leave her in the States. And then what you see on the Syrian border and as they go in is that the kind of violence has taken over so much that these things just kind of break down, that the kind of basic structures break down. And there's a moment with Daphne where he's been robbed, right? And they find, and he thinks he knows who's done it, and that he can find him, and he needs her help to kind of go after this guy who stole from him. And she says to him, "I never said I wouldn't help, but I won't help under the assumption that you're a good man punishing a bad man. I'm exhausted by those ideas." And I wanted to ask you about sort of notions of justice and what that could mean when there's just kind of such a wide-scale breakdown of society and so much violence, and how you move forward.
I think, in that passage specifically, it's just like a very instinctual understanding that, like, the last person you should probably preach political dogma to, is a woman who lost her child in a war. I think she's probably going to not have a lot of patience for someone's political visions and their ideology and someone rationalizing that sacrifice. But yeah, and to your point, I think a lot of those things, they break down in war, and wars can become very, very cyclical entities that feed on themselves. A point that's made in the book, and it was very evident to me, particularly in like 2013, 2014, in Syria, was this really palpable idea that people would walk around and they would say, like, the revolution is over and the war has begun. The idea being the revolution ending, meaning those ideas, the idea that this was going to be something that turned and there was going to be some type of new governing system, like that is over. Now we're just fighting this out.
No. And there's also the question of this kind of like home that somebody like Daphne is trying to recover, that's just gone. And I know you spoke of you have a Syrian poet friend.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. To your point, I did a piece, probably a piece of journalism, maybe a year ago or a little more. It was just about Syria's war poets and interviewing some of these folks. And a very dear friend of mine, to whom the book is dedicated. There's a very rich. Frankly, like every other person you meet, every other Syrian I met was in some way identified as a poet. And a very good friend of mine was the grandson of an extremely well-known poet, Nizar Kabani. And so he was sort of ground zero for a lot of these Syrian poets who gathered in Gaziantep. And so one of them was telling me in this piece that I was writing, he was actually talking about a little bit of this guilt he feels. He's like, I'm Syrian, I'm a poet, I've left, I'm writing poetry about what's going on. And he said, the only reason I have the freedom to do that is because of this revolution. But the people who are suffering for the revolution right now are trapped inside of Syria, and I've left. And then he went on to make the point to me, said, so this is the first time in my life that I've ever been able to write exactly what I want to write. And he said, and I feel like I'm doing some of like my very best work right now. And he said, but the problem with being a Syrian poet is there's no Syrian poetry if there's no Syria. And I think that, that tension, whether there's no Syrian poetry, there's no, name it without Syria. And that's what I think is very much obvious in what's going on in that country. Is it really kind of slips into a black hole.
Yeah, I think it's captured tremendously powerfully in the book. One last question before we open it up to questions from the audience. I'm sure people have a lot of questions. So there's an early scene in the book when somebody asks the character if he's a journalist or a researcher, and he says the words journalist and researcher the way that you would say the words pedophile and pimp.
And so for yourself, writing about this, and also doing journalism, and doing some research,
Yeah.
how do you avoid being a journalist, a pedophile and a pimp? Yeah.
I think what I was trying to get at there is, there are, looking at the conflict from someone who's, been deeply and profoundly affected by it, and I think you probably saw this in your experiences, there's this weird role that can sometimes exist where people are sort of almost like war tourists. And so, particularly with journalists, as friends of mine who frankly are more serious journalists than I was, filing, weekly or bi-weekly, would say things like, hey, should we go to this camp? I hear there's something going on. They say, you don't want to go there. I was like, why? No one's going to talk to you. They're just going to, they're going to like kick you out. They're going to chase you out of the camp. And we get chased out of these camps because people just say, you were here, you've been here, coming here for a year, these journalists. And what have you done for me? Nothing. And you're taking my stories and selling them to your editors. I'm not giving you these stories anymore. Leave. You've done nothing for us. And so there's this sort of fatigue that sets in. And then you have, humanitarian aid workers who come around saying I'm helping this way, but there's that fatigue that sets in. And amongst researchers who are doing humanitarian research. So, among the population where they don't see any return for that investment of time, of telling people their stories, it's just obvious. It's an obvious reaction. And so it was a reaction that, I could see sort of an animus that existed. So I just tried to, duly note it in the pages.
And how should we respond to that?
We being Americans?
The American public that, sees these images.
Well, I'm sure it's going to come up in our conversation, but I think we should be really wary of the idea that we're fighting a war by proxy, and we just adopted a policy that we're not going to allow anyone from the countries where we're fighting a war by proxy into our country. How do you think people are going to take it over there? Not well. None of us would take it very well. So I don't think that's surprising. It's a very human reaction. So I think we should be on notice.
Any questions? Yeah.
Hi, Elliot. My name's John. Let's go. When did you get the epiphany to write this book? When did it come to you?
That's a great and really hard question. Because you don't really know that you have a book a lot of the times. You just, or at least for me, I don't often write with an outline, and I just sort of start writing. And then maybe as I get into it, I feel like I have a book.
Did you start it when you were there, when you were over there?
Right. So I'll tell you. So the first, I was actually working on a book that was kind of similarly situated. It was like maybe 90 pages into a manuscript, and I don't know that it was really working. And I took a trip to the border, and I was down the border one day, and I come back to the U.S. about 2 weeks after that trip, and I was sitting with a friend of mine, and we were just talking about the trip. And I was explaining this one instance down at the border, and he basically said to me, he's like, you should write about that. And it wasn't something you would write about in like a journalistic piece, but I just started writing about that. And then suddenly it just sort of the book started coming out of that idea of a crossing, and this act of crossing being the central question in the book. And often I find in my, at least what I've noticed in my writing is that often it kind of everything gravitates around one central question and one central action, and how people behave in the face of that choice.
Thank you. I'm excited to read your book.
Thanks.
I'm Howard. Did you ever think about what kind of writer you would become had you not been exposed to war?
A happier writer. A friend of mine read the book 10 days ago. He was like, "Oh, I read the book." He's like, "Man, I loved it." I was like so depressed for 3 days afterwards. I was like, "Thank you." I think the one it's sort of tough because those experiences are so fundamental to who I am. I kind of cannot unweave them from my own understanding of the world. But I think that's something that that going to war does is it is a way and a vehicle where you see human behavior at extremes. Faulkner has this quote that I love and I often say. It's from his Nobel Prize acceptance speech where he says, "The only thing worth writing about is the human heart in conflict with itself." And I think nowhere do you see that greater in war, in so much as, all of human society is based off of this premise, thou shalt not kill. But then in war, we go out and there's sanctioned killing in order to uphold human society, which is built on the premise of not killing. It's sort of like the great John Lennon line, which is actually quoted to me by a Syrian friend, which is, killing for peace is like fucking for virginity. Like it doesn't make any sense. But so I see seeing that and living that kind of gives you exposure to that conflict, and I think that that's something I write about.
I should note that the book is so compelling that you'll tear through it and won't notice how horribly depressed you're becoming until after you're done.
Yeah, I wonder, Phil Klay, how your experiences in Iraq resonate with what Mr. Ackerman is saying about his experience. Do you see similar parallels or differences?
I mean, right. So that coming to grips with your ideals and what happened is I think pretty important to a lot of veterans. Because look, I joined. She actually started the process pre 9/11, right?
Mm-hmm.
I joined. I took my oath of office in the middle of 2005, right? So sort of Iraq wasn't going well. We knew that. I went to Iraq as part of the surge. Violence radically declined. We left feeling like we were winning, and then kind of only to watch the rise of ISIS and other things. So coming to grips with your position, I mean, morally, as a citizen, as someone who's been part of a war, where the net effect has been unbelievable amounts of chaos and horror, mostly for the Iraqi civilian population, certainly is something that drives a lot of what I write about. And then also the kind of the after effects and also the appeal of war. So yeah, absolutely. Though my experience, I was a public affairs officer, so my experience in war, I was never in combat. I wasn't, I'm not like a 5-tour superhero like Elliot here.
That's sweet of you, Phil.
Yeah. But I think the basic kind of moral questions and conflicts are very much present in the things that I think about. And a lot of it, I tell this story a lot, but I was at an event once and, this guy stood up and he said, I'm an Iraq vet. That used to be something I was incredibly proud of. If you asked me to make a resume of my life, not a resume for a job, but just like an accounting of who I was, what I was, all the major bullet points would have been combat veteran, Marine, NCO, led Marines in Iraq. But now I'm looking at Iraq and I'm looking at what's happening there and I'm wondering if I was part of an evil thing. And if I was part of an evil thing, can I be proud of that? And if I can't, then who am I and where do I go from there, right? And so, yeah, that's... But it's actually, and this is, I think, maybe the benefit of having been in the military, like, to be a member of a country means that at some point you're connected to horror, okay? And understanding that and thinking about where you go from there and how you sort of move the world forward. And also being part of all the great things that a country does, right? I'm a proud American citizen and proud to have served in the military, is vitally important. So I think it's kind of like a spur for a lot of basic questions that are common to any citizen.
How do you think it feels for American soldiers abroad at this point this week? Do they feel like let down by the provocations?
I think what's difficult in how this has been framed is that it's like an unequivocal cutting off, of people coming from Iraq, Syria, Somalia, the list of 7 into the U.S. And because it's a complete cutting off, it removes that chance. No matter how, it's always been very, very difficult for Iraqis or Afghans, even though Afghans aren't on this list, to get into the U.S., but many work with the Americans sort of with that hope. And so to just say it's no longer a hope, I think that's what's very, very difficult. Particularly as we are in a construct, if you look at our international affairs, where so much of our foreign policy and our fighting of wars is outsourced. Like we are fully engaged, and our interests are fully engaged. Like in a war in Iraq and a war in Syria, it's just like we're not fighting it. We're fighting it with very small amounts of advisors, but like those people are doing our work for us. So they didn't say, please do our work for us, but you're not welcome here. I mean, that's tough, and I'm fairly certain that if I were a service member now, it would be very difficult to be. That topic will come up. But it's not the first time it's come up. I mean, and this is a bipartisan thing too. I remember in 2009 when Obama announced the pullout from Afghanistan, just as we were surging in Afghanistan. I was in Afghanistan, and I was in villages talking to people, trying to convince them, hey, you need to work with us. We're gonna stop the Taliban, and they would laugh and say, your president just said you're leaving in 5 years. And there was a very famous saying, the Taliban saying, which was, you guys might have the watches, but we've got the time. So those announcements, they matter. I think we're kind of in a position of moral hazard right now because of it.
I think the positions of your average, member of the armed forces is a pretty diverse group. I think for certainly people kind of higher up involved in policy, it's a big problem. It makes the job more dangerous. So, we rely. You rely on local people, and I think that oftentimes we don't think about the second and third order effects of what we're doing, and oftentimes when we talk about military policy, there's this kind of blowhardy tough talk that has very little to do with any of the lessons that we've learned over the past, got 15 years. A lot of units early on in Iraq were pretty aggressive, kicking in doors. We learned pretty quickly that you get the most effects when you're closely tied in with the population. When we accidentally killed a civilian, tips went down about where IEDs were, where insurgents were. When they killed a civilian, tips went up. And those things represent lives, right? Yeah. George?
Yeah, I read your article about protecting your daughter from the knowledge of war. Is that kind of a goodbye to Istanbul? Have you left Istanbul for good, or?
I'm back here promoting the book now, then I'll be back over there in March, and then kind of bouncing between the two. But that piece was, something that has been interesting having kids there and living over there is the sense of like safety, and your sense of safety being relative, and something that kind of fascinates me. So like, for instance, living in Turkey, a bomb would go off in Ankara, let's say, which is 600 miles from Istanbul, and a handful of people would get killed. Sad, and I would get lots of anxious calls from home. Is everyone okay? Are you guys okay? Like, yes, everyone's fine. Thank you for checking in, which I appreciate. Those calls, I recognize it. But we will be here, and a bomb will go off in Midtown, or there'll be a school shooting. These things that we've really become used to. Frankly, mass shootings, Orlando, whatever it is, and we kind of don't check in with one another. You're just like, oh yeah, I'm sure everyone's fine. As long as you don't know, you don't know anyone who's too close to it. And it's sort of, why is it that we can look at a? I
have friends when there was the bomb in Times Square. Like people found, oh, there's a bomb in New York, and they were nervous. And friends were like, oh, it was in Times Square. That's where tourists go. Like,
right. And so what does that? What does that say about us as like Americans and how we engage with the world? And then what does it just say about anybody in the world? You talk to a Turk, like. They're sitting there, Erdogan's cracking down, bombs are going off, ISIS is doing more stuff, and it looks really bad in San Bernardino. And it's this idea of like foreignness. I think we're afraid of what is foreign to us. And so, personally with like my kids, I just want them to not feel like the world is a foreign, scary place. And I just think due to our geography, obviously as Americans, that's something that we have more of a propensity to feel, and it can manifest itself, frankly, as, back to this refugee ban, as it's manifesting itself now. Syrians, Iraq, scary. Don't even want to engage.
I was going to ask you, If you could project out a couple of years, what do you think it's going to be like in Syria, say 3 or 4 years down the road?
Oh, wow. Yeah. I don't know. I won't pretend to know. I think what's happening in Mosul right now is pretty important. I maybe offer an observation. When I was in Iraq in the fall, in Mosul, spent some time with the Iraqi counterterrorism forces, just sort of riding along with them. And one of the things that really struck me was how incredibly proficient they were. Like they were good soldiers, very competent. And then talking to them too, they had been, the last year has been very difficult in Iraq. I mean, they've been facing set piece battles in Fallujah and Ramadi, and Tikrit, like as they've been rolling kind of ISIS back towards the Syrian border. But then talking to these guys, they of course they all have American gear, and I had this like sort of weird deja vu. It's like, we finally trained up our Iraqi forces to be as competent as we are. And remarkably, they're facing all the exact same challenges we face, because they'd be like, yeah, we did great winning the battle, but how are we ever going to convince these Sunni towns to support us? We're a bunch of Shiite guys from Baghdad, and they were foreigners there. So that to me was sort of like a startling irony that you almost felt like you were just watching this cycle repeat. And I don't think any of that will be solved in the next couple of years. And I think there are really big issues with taking back these swaths of Syria that have been taken over by the Islamic State.
I think I have time for one more. Yeah, I just had it as a small point, but I found it interesting when you made an analogy between marriage and revolution. Because to be honest, it seems as though there is so much less at stake in the former than in the latter.
You mean more at stake in a marriage?
No, more at stake in a revolution.
Oh, who knows?
I'm saying this as someone whose husband died and I miss him every single day.
No, I know.
So, I'm not making light of marriage.
No, I know you're not. I think that but for me, the fundamental point there is that, politics is an emotional realm. I mean, it really is. All of our emotions are being played upon every day, and so, just my interest for whatever reason is, trying to kind of write books and tell stories that sort of explore that emotional space. And to do that, I'm often just trying to kind of find, equivalencies, because you're certainly not going to feel anything if you're like reading a book about how like the PYD Kurdish fighting group is different than the YPG, and now they're going to Mosul, and we just get lost in that. Like maybe the truth isn't there, maybe it's somewhere else.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.